It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway. Just me, my best friend Jake, and the great outdoors. We'd been planning this camping trip for months, a chance to unplug, unwind, and escape the chaos of the city. We picked a remote spot in the woods, somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains. No cell service, no people, just nature. At least, that's what we thought. The first day was great. We hiked for hours, set up camp by a crystal clear stream, and spent the evening roasting marshmallows and telling stupid jokes. But as the sun dipped below the trees, the woods grew eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, not even the rustle of leaves. It was like the forest was holding its breath. Jake noticed it first. "You hear that?" he asked, his voice low. "Hear what?" I replied, trying to sound casual. But I felt it too, a heavy, oppressive silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. "Just nothing." We laughed it off, but the unease lingered. That night, as we zipped ourselves into our tent, the temperature dropped suddenly. It was July, but it felt like winter. I remember shivering in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind howl through the trees. And then, around midnight, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping on the side of the tent. I froze. "Jake," I whispered, "do you hear that?" He was already awake, his eyes wide in the dim glow of our lantern. "Yeah," he muttered, "probably just a branch." But it didn't sound like a branch. It was too deliberate, too human. Tap, tap, tap. Like someone was out there gently knocking, waiting for us to answer. "Should we check it out?" I asked, my voice trembling. Jake hesitated, then nodded. "Stay behind me." We unzipped the tent slowly, the sound of the zipper unnaturally loud in the silence. Jake stepped out first, flashlight in hand. I followed, clutching my pocket knife like it could protect me from whatever was out there. The beam of the flashlight swept across the campsite. Nothing, just the trees, the stream, and our fire pit, now reduced to glowing embers. The tapping had stopped. "See?" Jake said, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." But as we turned to go back inside, the flashlight flickered. And then, from the darkness beyond the trees, came a sound that made my blood run cold. Laughter. It was faint, almost musical, but there was something wrong with it. Something inhuman. It echoed through the woods, bouncing off the trees until I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Jake swung the flashlight around, but the beam only reached so far. Beyond it was pure, impenetrable blackness. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't argue. We grabbed our backpacks, leaving the tent behind, and started down the trail we'd come in on. But the woods didn't look the same. The trees seemed closer together, the path narrower, and the laughter followed us, always just out of sight. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into a clearing. In the center was an old, crumbling cabin. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, but the door was slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from inside. "We can't stay out here," Jake said, his breath visible in the cold air. "Maybe there's a phone or something." I didn't want to go in, but I didn't have a better idea. The laughter was getting louder, more insistent. We stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind us. The interior was a nightmare. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. The floor was littered with animal bones, and in the center of the room was a chair. A single wooden chair facing away from us. "Hello?" Jake called, his voice shaking. The chair creaked as it slowly turned around. There was no one sitting in it, but as we watched, the symbols on the walls began to glow, and the laughter filled the room, deafening now. I felt something grab my arm, cold and bony, and I screamed. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital. Jake was there, his face pale and drawn. He told me we'd been found wandering on the side of the road, miles from the campsite. They said we'd been missing for 3 days. But that's not the worst part. When they searched the woods, they found the cabin, or at least what was left of it. It had burned to the ground decades ago, and in the ashes they found a single wooden chair. I still hear the laughter sometimes late at night, and I know deep down that whatever was in those woods, it's not done with us.
Story number 2.
It was the summer of 1998, and I was 16 years old. My parents had decided to take a 2-week vacation to Europe, leaving me home alone for the first time. I was thrilled. No rules, no curfews, just me in the house to myself. But by the third night, I started to notice something was off. It began with the noises. Late at night, when the house was supposed to be silent, I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling or maybe the wind. But the footsteps had a rhythm to them, like someone was pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds kept getting louder. One night, I mustered the courage to open my door and check. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, like I wasn't alone. I quickly shut the door and locked it, my heart pounding. The next morning, I found scratches on the door, deep, jagged marks that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. I told myself it was probably the cat, even though we didn't have one. Things escalated quickly after that. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a radio playing in another room, but I could never make out the words. Sometimes I'd feel a cold breath on the back of my neck, even though no one was there. One night, I decided to record the sounds. I set up an old tape recorder in the hallway and left it running while I slept. The next morning, I played it back. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, clear as day, I heard a voice. It was low and guttural, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. But the tone was unmistakable. It was angry. I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call my parents. They'd think I was crazy. So I did the only thing I could think of. I invited my friend Sarah over. She was the only person I trusted to believe me. Sarah arrived that evening, and I told her everything. She listened patiently, but I could tell she was skeptical. That changed when we heard the footsteps again. They were louder this time, coming from the attic. "You hear that, right?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sarah nodded, her face pale. "Yeah, I hear it." We grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs to the attic. The door was slightly ajar and the air was freezing. I pushed it open, and the beam of the flashlight revealed something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in the same symbols I'd seen in my dreams, and in the center of the room was a circle of candles. Their wax melted into strange, twisted shapes. But the most horrifying part was the figure standing in the corner. It was tall and thin, with skin that looked like it had been stretched too tight over its bones. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, like it was waiting for something. Sarah screamed, and we bolted down the stairs. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. The attic was empty, and the symbols were gone. I spent the rest of the summer at Sarah's house. When my parents returned, I told them what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They said it was just my imagination, fueled by being alone for too long. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still there, waiting. I hear it sometimes late at night, whispering my name, and I know one day it's going to come back for me.
Story number 3.
It was the summer of 2005, and I was working as a camp counselor at a remote summer camp in the Adirondack Mountains. The camp was nestled deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. It was beautiful during the day, but at night the forest seemed to come alive with shadows and whispers. The camp had a legend, a story about a boy who had gone missing decades ago. His name was Tommy, and he'd vanished during a game of hide and seek. They never found him, but some of the older counselors claimed they'd seen his ghost wandering the woods, still searching for a place to hide. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the kids loved the story. They'd sit around the campfire, wide-eyed, as the senior counselors told the tale. It was all fun and games until the third week of camp. That's when the strange things started happening. It began with the laughter. Late at night, when the camp was quiet, I'd hear a child's laughter coming from the woods. It was faint, almost like an echo, but it sent chills down my spine. I'd check the cabins, but all the kids were asleep. Then came the footsteps. I'd be walking back to my cabin after lights out, and I'd hear someone following me. When I turned around, there was no one there. But the footsteps kept coming, closer and closer, until I was running to my cabin, slamming the door behind me. The final straw was the night I saw him. I was on night duty, making my rounds to ensure all the cabins were secure. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the camp. As I passed the old storage shed, I heard a noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping like someone knocking on wood. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a boy, no older than 10. He was wearing old-fashioned clothes, a striped shirt and suspenders, and his face was pale, almost translucent, But the most horrifying part was his eyes. They were black, empty voids that seemed to suck the light right out of the air. "Tommy?" I whispered, my voice shaking. The boy smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, almost predatory. He raised a finger to his lips as if to shush me, and then he was gone, vanishing into the shadows. I ran back to the main lodge, my heart pounding. The other counselors thought I was crazy, but I knew what I'd seen. Tommy was real, and he was still out there. The next morning, one of the campers was missing. His name was Ethan, and he'd been in my cabin. We searched the camp, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. The police were called, and a massive search party was organized, but they found nothing. That night, I heard the laughter again. It was louder this time, almost gleeful. I followed the sound, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. It led me to the old storage shed. The door was slightly ajar, and the air was freezing. I pushed it open, and the beam of the flashlight revealed something that made my blood run cold. Ethan was there, sitting in the corner. His eyes were wide with terror, and his mouth was frozen in a silent scream. But he wasn't alone. Standing beside him was Tommy, his black eyes gleaming with malice. I tried to grab Ethan, but Tommy stepped in front of him, his smile widening. "He's mine now," he whispered, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. I don't remember how I got out of there. All I know is that I ran, leaving Ethan behind. The police found his body the next day, hidden in the woods. They said he died of exposure, but I knew the truth. Tommy had taken him. I quit my job that summer and never went back to the camp. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the laughter. And I know Tommy's still out there, waiting for his next victim.
Story number 4.
It was the fall of 2012, and I had just moved into my first apartment. It was a small, one-bedroom place on the 3rd floor of an old building in the heart of the city. The rent was cheap, and the location was perfect, but there was something about the building that made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way the floors creaked at night, or the way the shadows seemed to linger in the corners. Whatever it was, I told myself it was just my imagination. The first few weeks were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, hung up some pictures, and tried to make the place feel like home. But then the dreams started. They were always the same. I'd be standing in the living room, and the air would grow cold. The lights would flicker, and then I'd hear it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on the door. I'd open it, and there would be a woman standing there. She was tall and thin, with long dark hair that covered her face. She'd reach out to me, her fingers bony and cold, and then I'd wake up, drenched in sweat. I tried to brush it off as stress, but the dreams kept coming. And then, one night, I woke up to find the woman standing at the foot of my bed. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. She was just standing there, her head tilted to the side, like she was studying me. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to move, but my body wouldn't obey. All I could do was watch as she slowly raised her hand and pointed to the corner of the room. And then, she was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I called my landlord and asked about the apartment's history. He was hesitant at first, but after some prodding, he told me the truth. The previous tenant had been a woman named Emily. She'd lived in the apartment for years, but one night she'd simply vanished. The police had searched the building, but they'd found no trace of her. The case had gone cold, and the apartment had been empty ever since. I was horrified, but I couldn't afford to move, so I did the only thing I could think of. I bought a Ouija board. I know it sounds crazy, but I was desperate. I needed to know what had happened to Emily, and I thought maybe, just maybe, she could tell me. That night, I set up the board in the living room. I lit a few candles, turned off the lights, and placed my fingers on the planchette. "Emily," I whispered, "are you here?" The planchette moved immediately, sliding to the word, "Yes." I took a deep breath. "What happened to you?" The planchette began to move again, spelling out a single word, "Hide." "Hide?" I repeated, my voice trembling. "Hide from what?" The planchette didn't move. Instead, the temperature in the room dropped, and the candles flickered. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and I knew I wasn't alone. I turned around, and there she was, Emily. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. She reached out to me, her fingers brushing against my arm, and she was gone. The next morning, I started packing. I didn't care about the lease or the money. I just wanted to get out. But as I was carrying a box to my car, I noticed something strange. The corner of the building, the one Emily had pointed to in my dream, was cracked, and peeking out from the crack was a piece of fabric. I called the police, and they came with a team to investigate. They tore open the wall, and inside, they found Emily's body. She'd been sealed in the wall, her face frozen in a silent scream. The police never found out who killed her, but I didn't stick around to find out. I moved out that same day, leaving everything behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping, and I know Emily's still out there, waiting for someone to find her.
Story number 5.
It was the winter of 2016, and I was driving home from a late shift at work. The roads were icy, and the snow was coming down hard, reducing visibility to almost nothing. I was on a back road, the kind that cuts through the woods and seems to go on forever, when my car skidded on a patch of black ice. I lost control, the tires spinning uselessly as the car veered off the road and into the trees. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment I just sat there, dazed and disoriented. When I finally gathered my senses, I realized the car was stuck. The front end was wedged between two trees, and the engine had died. I tried my phone, but there was no signal. The snow was coming down harder now, and I knew I couldn't stay in the car. I grabbed my coat and stepped out into the freezing night. The woods were eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath my boots. I started walking, hoping to find a house or a road, but everything looked the same, endless trees and snow. After what felt like hours, I saw a light in the distance. It was faint, but it was there, flickering like a beacon. I followed it, my hope growing with every step. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin. It was old and weathered, with smoke curling from the chimney. I knocked on the door, my hands numb from the cold. The door creaked open, and an elderly man appeared. He was tall and thin, with a long, white beard and piercing blue eyes. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside and gestured for me to come in. The inside of the cabin was warm and cozy, with a fire crackling in the hearth. The man motioned for me to sit by the fire, and I did, grateful for the warmth. He handed me a cup of tea, and I sipped it slowly, feeling the heat spread through my body. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse. "I was in a car accident, and my phone doesn't work, and I couldn't find my way out of the woods." The man nodded, but didn't speak. He just sat in a chair across from me, watching me with those piercing eyes. I tried to make conversation, but he remained silent. Eventually, I gave up and just sat there, staring into the fire. The warmth and the tea made me drowsy, and before I knew it, I was nodding off. I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like the rustle of leaves, but it was there. I opened my eyes and looked around. The fire had down, and the cabin was dark, except for the glow of the embers. The old man was gone. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the corners of the room, from the shadows that seemed to writhe and shift. I stood up, my heart pounding, and backed away from the fire. And then I saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, emerging from the darkness. They were tall and thin, with elongated limbs and faces that were little more than smudges. They moved toward me, their whispers growing into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once. I turned and ran for the door, but it was locked. The figures closed in, their whispers becoming screams. I felt cold hands on my arms, my legs, pulling me down. I fought, but there were too many of them. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The figures were gone, and the cabin was silent. I was alone, lying on the floor by the fire. The old man was back, sitting in his chair, watching me with those piercing eyes. What was that?" I stammered, my voice shaking. The man didn't answer. He just pointed to the door. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my coat and ran out into the night. The snow had stopped, and the moon was shining brightly, illuminating the path back to the road. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the road, I found a passing motorist who called for help. The police and a tow truck arrived, and I was able to get my car out of the trees. I told them about the cabin, but when they went to look for it, there was nothing there, just an empty clearing in the woods. I never went back to that road, and I never told anyone else about what happened. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispering, and I know they're still out there, waiting in the shadows.
Story number 6.
It was the summer of 2008, and I was working as a night security guard at an old, abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. The place had been closed for decades, but the owners still wanted someone to keep an eye on it. I didn't mind the job. It was quiet and the pay was decent. But I quickly learned that the hospital had a dark history. The building was massive, with long, echoing hallways and rooms filled with rusted medical equipment. The power had been cut years ago, so I carried a flashlight with me as I made my rounds. The first few nights were uneventful, but then I started hearing things. It began with the sound of footsteps. I'd be walking down a hallway, and I'd hear someone behind me. When I turned around, there was no one there. But the footsteps kept coming, always just out of sight. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but they grew louder with each passing night. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was angry, almost hateful. The final straw was the night I saw her. I was making my rounds on the third floor, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I passed an old operating room, I heard a noise, a soft rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking on glass. I froze, my heart pounding. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and hollow. But the most horrifying part was her smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like it had been carved into her face. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted down the hallway. I didn't stop until I was back in the security office, the door locked behind me. The next morning, I did some research on the hospital. What I found made my blood run cold. The hospital had been the site of numerous unexplained deaths in the years before it closed. Patients had gone missing, and staff had reported strange occurrences, whispers in the halls, shadowy figures, and the sound of footsteps when no one was there. The final straw had been the death of a nurse who had been found in one of the operating rooms with a smile carved into her face. I quit my job that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And sometimes late at night, I hear the whispers. They're faint, almost like the rustle of leaves, but I know they're there, and I know she's still out there, waiting in the shadows.
Story number 7.
It was the fall of 2014, and I had just moved into a new house. It was an old Victorian home with creaky floors and drafty windows, but it was all I could afford. The real estate agent had warned me that the house had a history, but I didn't care. It was mine, and I was determined to make it a home. The first few weeks were uneventful. I unpacked my boxes, hung up some pictures, and tried to make the place feel cozy. But then the strange things started happening. It began with the cold spots. I'd be walking through the house, and suddenly the temperature would drop. It was like stepping into a freezer, and no matter how much I cranked up the heat, the cold spots remained. Then came the noises. Late at night, when the house was supposed to be silent, I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallway. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling, but the footsteps had a rhythm to them, like someone was pacing back and forth outside my bedroom door. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds kept getting louder. One night, I mustered the courage to open my door and check. The hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, like I wasn't alone. I quickly shut the door and locked it, my heart pounding. The next morning, I found scratches on the door. Deep, jagged marks that looked like they'd been made by fingernails. I told myself it was probably the cat, even though I didn't have one. Things escalated quickly after that. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of whispering. It was faint, almost like a radio playing in another room, but I could never make out the words. Sometimes I'd feel a cold breath on the back of my neck, even though no one was there. One night, I decided to record the sounds. I set up an old tape recorder in the hallway and left it running while I slept. The next morning, I played it back. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, clear as day, I heard a voice. It was low and guttural, speaking in a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. It was angry. I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do. I couldn't call the police. They'd think I was crazy. So, I did the only thing I could think of. I invited my friend Sarah over. She was the only person I trusted to believe me. Sarah arrived that evening, and I told her everything. She listened patiently, but I could tell she was skeptical. That changed when we heard the footsteps again. They were louder this time, coming from the attic. "You hear that, right?" I asked, my voice trembling. Sarah nodded, her face pale. Yeah, I hear it. We grabbed a flashlight and climbed the stairs to the attic. The door was slightly ajar, and the air was freezing. I pushed it open, and the beam of the flashlight revealed something that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood, and in the center of the room was a circle of candles, their wax melted into strange, twisted shapes. But the most horrifying part was the figure standing in the corner. It was tall and thin, with skin that looked like it had been stretched too tight over its bones. Its eyes were black voids, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, like it was waiting for something. Sarah screamed, and we bolted down the stairs. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath. I called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. The attic was empty, and the symbols were gone. I spent the rest of the night at Sarah's house. When I returned home the next day, I found a note on the kitchen table. It was written in the same strange symbols I'd seen in the attic, but at the bottom there was a single word in English: leave. I didn't need to be told twice. I packed my bags and moved out that same day, leaving everything behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers, and I know it's still there, waiting in the shadows.
Story number 8.
It was the summer of 2010, and I was backpacking through Europe with my best friend, Claire. We'd been planning the trip for years, and we were finally living the dream. We'd seen the Eiffel Tower, the Colosseum, and the canals of Venice, but it was in a small, remote village in the Carpathian Mountains that our adventure took a dark turn. The village was called Valcea, and it was like something out of a fairy tale. Quaint cottages, cobblestone streets, and a dense forest that surrounded the town like a protective wall. The locals were friendly, but there was something about the way they looked at us, like they knew something we didn't. We decided to stay for a few days, renting a room in a small inn at the edge of the village. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with a kind smile, warned us not to wander into the forest after dark. The woods are old, she said, her voice low. They have secrets. We laughed it off, thinking it was just a superstition. But that night, as we lay in bed, we heard it, a faint, melodic humming coming from the forest. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, and it drew us in like a siren song. Do you hear that? Claire whispered, her eyes wide. I nodded, my heart pounding. Let's check it out. We grabbed our flashlights and slipped out of the inn, following the sound into the woods. The trees were thick, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The humming grew louder as we ventured deeper, and soon we found ourselves in a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a figure, a woman, dressed in a flowing white gown. She was beautiful, with long, dark hair and pale skin that seemed to glow in the darkness. She was singing, her voice echoing through the trees. We stood there, transfixed as she danced around the clearing, her movements graceful and otherworldly. But then she stopped and turned to face us. Her eyes were black, like two voids, and her smile was too wide, too sharp. You shouldn't be here, she said, her voice like ice. We turned and ran, the woman's laughter echoing behind us. We didn't stop until we were back at the inn, our hearts pounding and our breath coming in ragged gasps. The next morning, we told the innkeeper what had happened. Her face turned pale, and she crossed herself. You saw the lady of the forest, she said, her voice trembling. She is a spirit, a vengeful one. She lures travelers into the woods and takes them. We didn't need to hear more. We packed our bags and left the village that same day, vowing never to return. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the humming, and I know she's still out there, waiting in the shadows.
Story number 9.
It was the winter of 2018, and I was staying at my grandparents' old farmhouse in the countryside. The house had been in the family for generations, but no one had lived there for years. My grandparents had passed away, and the place had been left to rot. I decided to spend the holidays there, partly out of nostalgia and partly because I needed a break from the city. The farmhouse was as I remembered it, creaky floors, drafty windows, and a sense of history that permeated every room. But there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was like the house was alive, watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time cleaning and exploring, trying to make the place feel like home. But then, the strange things started happening. It began with the whispers. Late at night, when the house was supposed to be silent, I'd hear faint voices coming from the walls. At first, I brushed it off as the wind, but the whispers had a rhythm to them, like a conversation I couldn't quite hear. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds kept getting louder. One night, I mustered the courage to follow the whispers. They led me to the basement, a place I'd been avoiding since I arrived. The basement was dark and damp, with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The whispers were louder here, almost like they were coming from the walls themselves. I grabbed a flashlight and started to explore, my heart pounding with every step. And then I saw it. In the corner of the basement was a door, old and weathered, with a heavy lock on it. The whispers were coming from behind the door, and they were louder now, more insistent. I tried the lock, but it was rusted shut. I didn't know what to do, so I went back upstairs and tried to forget about it. But the whispers followed me, growing louder and more urgent with each passing night. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a crowbar and went back to the basement, determined to open the door. It took some effort, but eventually the lock gave way and the door creaked open. The room behind the door was small and dark, with a single chair in the center. On the chair was a doll, old and weathered, with a face that seemed almost human. The whispers were coming from the doll, and as I watched, its head turned to face me. I screamed and dropped the flashlight, the beam of light bouncing wildly as I stumbled back. The doll's eyes followed me, its mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. I ran out of the basement and didn't stop until I was back in the city. I never went back to the farmhouse, and I never told anyone what I'd seen. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers, and I know the doll is still there, waiting in the shadows.
Story number 10.
It was the summer of 2015, and I was working as a tour guide at an old historic mansion in New England. The place was a popular tourist attraction, known for its beautiful architecture and rich history. But there was a darker side to the mansion, one that wasn't mentioned in the brochures. The mansion had been built in the 1800s by a wealthy industrialist, and it had been the site of numerous tragedies over the years. There were rumors of suicides, murders, and even a few disappearances. But the most famous story was that of the Lady in White. According to legend, the Lady in White was the ghost of the industrialist's wife, who had died under mysterious circumstances. She was said to haunt the mansion, appearing to visitors and staff alike. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the stories were enough to give me chills. The first few weeks on the job were uneventful. I gave tours, answered questions, and tried to ignore the creepy atmosphere of the place. But then, the strange things started happening. It began with the cold spots. I'd be walking through the mansion, and suddenly, the temperature would drop. It was like stepping into a freezer, and no matter how much I cranked up the heat, the cold spots remained. Then came the noises. Late at night, when the mansion was empty, I'd hear faint footsteps in the hallways. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling, but the footsteps had a rhythm to them, like someone was pacing back and forth. I tried to ignore it, but the sounds kept getting louder. One night, I mustered the courage to follow the footsteps. They led me to the ballroom, a grand, ornate room with a large chandelier and floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was dark, but I could see a figure standing in the center. It was a woman dressed in a flowing white gown. Her back was to me, and she was swaying gently like she was dancing to music only she could hear. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The woman stopped and turned to face me. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and hollow. But the most horrifying part was her smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like it had been carved into her face. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice like ice. I turned and ran, the woman's laughter echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I was back in the staff room, my heart pounding and my breath coming in ragged gasps. The next morning, I told my boss what had happened. He listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't believe me. "It's just a story," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "Don't let it get to you." But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew she was still there, waiting in the shadows. I quit my job that day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the footsteps. They're faint, almost like the rustle of leaves, but I know they're there. And I know she's still out there, waiting in the shadows.